Bonjour. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, passed by France's revolutionary government, the National Assembly, in 1789 to sort of formalize and clarify the purposes of the French Revolution, but also the type of government that the National Assembly and the revolutionaries intended to set up in place of the Ancient regime, the government of Louis XVI, who had been deposed and I think was later, this was adopted August 26th, 1789. I don't remember what date Louis met Madame Guillotine, but I think Louis loses his head after this. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is a very, very interesting document. It comes out of the same revolutionary period as, say, the American Declaration of Independence, which in some ways is not a bad analog. Actually, I'm going to, I think, be talking a decent amount in this video comparing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen to the Declaration of Independence, but also to the U.S. Constitution, because in a way the Declaration of Rights kind of does similar things. And for my American viewers, at least, that will potentially be a useful context. For people from other countries, that may or may not be enlightening. But actually starting out right from the beginning, there's an interesting difference between the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen versus the United States Constitution. The U.S. Constitution famously begins with the words, "We the people." The Declaration begins, "The representatives of the French people organized in National Assembly." Now this is kind of interesting because the phrase "we the people" implies the people as a whole, but in reality the Constitution was devised and approved by a comparatively small portion of citizens. You had to be male, you had to be white, you had to be property owning. Generally speaking, you had to have some sort of power or influence within your state in order to get to the point where you could be somebody who got a vote on whether or not to adopt the Constitution. So the idea of "we the people" really conflates the citizenry as a whole with the small group of elite people who decided on the Constitution. The Declaration, on the other hand, has a much more clear explanation of who it is that's actually doing the approving of this document, and what their relationship is to the people as a whole. The representatives of the French people organized in National Assembly. So it's clear here that this is a document that conceptualizes representative government, not in the sort of sleight of hand way that the U.S. Constitution does, where it says, "We, the representatives, are the people." Here, the National Assembly is saying, we are adopting this document on behalf of the people, but we, the representatives, are not synonymous with that. So that's a really interesting distinction to start out with. Then they list the exigence, which in rhetorical terminology is the thing that has prompted them to act. So they say, "The representatives of the French people organized in National Assembly, considering that ignorance, forgetfulness, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole causes of the public miseries and of the corruption of governments." So that's what they're attempting to avoid, ostensibly. They are laying out the foundations, the fundamental principles of the revolutionary government, of revolutionary France, in order to try and build a better society that does not have the flaws of the Ancient regime. Then they establish a set of 3 goals. have resolved to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man. So that's interesting. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote most of the Declaration of Independence, did actually consult on the Declaration of Rights. And so there is people who know their Declaration of Independence will hear some echoes. Natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man being one of them. But then we get the three things that this document is supposed to do. In order that this declaration, being ever present to all members of the social body, may unceasingly remind them of their rights and their duties. So goal 1, this was a publicly disseminated document. It was widely available both in France and beyond. This is meant to let people actually know what the revolutionary government stands for. 2, in order that the acts of the legislative power and those of the executive power may be each moment compared with the aim of every political institution and thereby may be more respected. So to ensure that the actions of the government align with the values of the revolution. And 3, in order that the demands of the citizens, grounded henceforth upon simple and incontestable principles, may always take the direction of maintaining the Constitution and the welfare of all. So this idea that the government is not just the representatives, it's not just the people in the National Assembly, the government is of and by and through the people of France. So the people have a responsibility to protect the values laid out in the Declaration of Rights, to ensure that these rights aren't abused or violated, etc., etc. So there's a very, at least implicitly, active component of this document, that there's an active set of expectations that the Declaration of Rights lays out for what the people of France should be doing. Now, we then get into a list of 17 things, 17 key principles of the revolutionary government. As we go through this, you will see a lot of echoes of thinkers in the liberal tradition, people like John Locke, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence, etc., etc. A lot of the principles that are being laid out by these types of thinkers are showing up in the Declaration of Rights. So the first statement here is men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The famous opening line of Rousseau's The Social Contract is, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Here we have a very direct, I think, allusion to that, and a reversal of the negative component from Rousseau. They have eliminated the chains. Marx would be thrilled. Karl Marx would be thrilled. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Man is born free. The chains are now cast off because of the revolution. The second principle, the aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. Those rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. That listing of rights, liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, draws on both John Locke, who famously talked about life, liberty, and property, but also the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which says the inalienable rights of man, or humans, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So here they have a slightly different set of values: life, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The last one is the most interesting one for me, because again, the Ancient regime was an absolutist monarchy. They are abolishing that. They are abolishing the idea that social class oppression is acceptable. Theoretically, they're abolishing the idea of gendered oppression, although in reality that didn't happen. But they're abolishing this idea that one group of people is better than another and can take advantage of another group of people. Next, we have this very interesting one that sort of just stands on its own. Number 3 basically says the nation is supreme. And today, for us, in a world defined largely by nation states, that seems like kind of an obvious and maybe not that important point. But in a world, in the world of the Ancien regime in France, pre-revolutionary France, it was not the nation, it was the king. Louis XIV famously said, "L'état c'est moi." My French is bad, just so you know. I am the state. So the idea was that France didn't exist as a nation. France existed in the person of the king. And the revolutionary government says, no, France is a nation. It is a political and perhaps geographic entity not embodied by any person. So that's actually a much more revolutionary point in 1789 than it is today. Next, we get some really interesting ones, 4, 5, and 6, which kind of embody the principle that will later be theorized in more depth by John Stuart Mill, the mid-19th century English philosopher. So number 4 explains the key principle here. Liberty consists in the power to do anything that does not injure others. So basically, that's the idea. That's one of John Stuart Mill's big contributions to liberal philosophy, is this idea that as long as I am not damaging anybody else or curtailing anybody else's rights, I should have the absolute right to do whatever I want. And so here this is laid out, and we have slight variations on this in points 5 and 6. But the other interesting thing in point 6 is this opening sentence, law is the expression of the general will. And that idea of general will comes directly out of Rousseau. That was his sort of one of his major contributions to liberal philosophy, is this idea that there's a general agreement among people within a body politic about what should be done. And personal interests can distort that or limit that or whatever it is. But fundamentally, there is a central agreement which is represented in some not especially well-defined way by government that is properly representative. Next, we have several things about due process, this idea that you can't sort of detain somebody, you can't arrest them, you can't put them in prison without certain rights, certain processes being followed through. And this, of course, is a really important one because on July 14th, 1789, one of the things, or possibly the thing, depending on how we tell the history of it, the thing that kicked off the French Revolution was the storming of the Bastille prison, the Bastille, as we normally say in Anglophone countries. The Bastille was this sort of symbol of the monarchy's absolute power because the king could have anyone arrested for any reason, no charges, no appeals, no jury trial, nothing like this, no evidentiary rights or anything like this. The king could have you thrown in prison, or the king's representative could have you thrown in prison, and there was nothing you could do about it. So one of the rights, or one of the sets of rights that the revolutionary government guarantees is that you will have due process of law and equality before the law. Everybody will be treated the same under the law. That's an amazing transition from the France of pre-1789. We next get a couple of points about freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. The revolutionary government had a somewhat ambiguous relationship with religion. part of the problem in pre-revolutionary France was the power of the Catholic Church, which had more or less absolute power. And so a lot of revolutionaries were stridently anti-religious. Whether that was anti-theist or whether that was atheist depends on how we understand what was going on with particular groups, but there was definitely attacks on the church. And so there are always these sort of tensions, because France was still basically a Catholic country. There's always these sort of tensions when you have a revolutionary government that tries to more or less impose atheism on a religious population. It often doesn't work that well, so you have to have these sort of weird, like, officially we're atheists, but we'll look the other way while you continue practicing your faith, because we can't very well ensure that all of the peasants of France have adopted atheism in place of the Catholicism they've practiced for centuries. So you get these sort of weird tensions. A lot of the next bits are really sort of related to the running of the government, the running of a revolutionary government. They're 12 and 13 deal with the maintenance of a public force to protect basically the revolution, to protect the rights of man and of the citizen, and the taxes that need to be raised in order to do that. But these elements are also tied to questions of accountability, government accountability. Because one of the problems of the Ancien regime was that the king could levy taxes at will, and there was no mechanism to stop him. So if he said, I want a 100% tax of all your property, you had no recourse for that. So while the National Assembly is here saying, in order to ensure that these rights are protected, we have to have a police or a military or whatever it is, and we can fund that through taxes. Any citizen can question and challenge and seek an accounting of taxation, why that money is being taken, how much money is being taken, where it's being spent, etc., etc. So that idea of government accountability to the people is a really big break from what had come before. And then the last one is an interesting one, number 17. It says, property being a sacred and inviolable right, no one can be deprived of it unless a legally established public necessity evidently demands it under the condition of a just and prior indemnity. On the one hand, that's not a very revolutionary principle, in that it seems to protect property. And the aristocracy and the monarchy and the church had the majority of the property in pre-revolutionary France. So, in a sense, that seems to protect the status quo. Those with property should get to keep it. And if the majority of the property is held by people in the upper social classes who have been exploitative, that can be seen as anti-revolutionary. At the same time, though, the idea that individual property rights exist was a revolutionary idea because, again, under the Ancien regime, the king could come along and say, hey, that's some nice property you've got there. That'll be mine now. And there was nothing that anyone could do about it. So the idea of protecting property from sort of arbitrary seizure, the arbitrary demand of the monarch or whatever it is, was actually quite a big move. This is also an idea rooted in John Locke, because he is very much of the opinion in a document like the Second Treatise on Government. Locke is very much of the opinion that governments are fundamentally instituted among humanity to protect property rights. So again, this is part of that liberal tradition, but it's existing in this sort of weird tension within the revolutionary government of France.